The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on Monocle Radio on the 22nd of July 2024. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Vincent McAviney. Coming up on today's programme.
The most existential, consequential, and important election of our lifetime. And there is so much at stake.
From supporting character to protagonist, can Kamala Harris now secure the Democratic nomination? Governments around the world are watching closely and hedging their bets in public statements. But would a President Harris represent any shifts in US foreign policy? Plus,
and that makes events like this and the role that you play ever more important for the defence and security of our country.
New UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer among those at the Farnborough Airshow this week, along with our very own Andrew Muller. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Vincent McAviney. Well, welcome to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. It is, of course, going to be a special episode of the programme because there is only one story dominating global headlines, and that is the sort of not shocking announcement in the end that President Biden was withdrawing from the presidential race. Joining me in the studio is Monocle's senior news editor Chris Chermak and Ryan Williams, executive vice president of Targeted Victory and former spokesman for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. And down the line from New York, we have Jamie Floyd, New York-based attorney, journalist and author who previously worked in the White House with the then Senator Joe Biden. Chris, if I can come to you first, can you catch us up on the weekend's sequencing?
So, Vinny, it actually kind of starts with Friday, I think it's fair to say, because it was on that day where you had about a dozen new Democrats from Congress, a couple of senators, as well as congressmen who called on Joe Biden publicly to step away. This was after Donald Trump had accepted the nomination for Republicans this week as well. And so it sort of brought this whole conversation back into the forefront. And that's what Joe Biden headed into this weekend, where he was in Delaware. He, of course, had COVID. There were regular updates on that as well, but he was at home. He was meeting with advisors there. And if reports are to be believed, at least, after his meetings with advisors, looking at polling numbers, things like that as well on Saturday, he went to bed on Saturday night, basically having made this decision that he was going to step away from the race. But he did sleep on it on, Sunday morning, had one more gut check, if you will. At that point, also had a number of calls with Kamala Harris to discuss the process. And it was in the afternoon on Sunday where he finally did make this statement, which he released on Twitter or X, basically saying that he was stepping down from the campaign, but not stepping back from the presidency itself. That was something he would continue to serve as president until the end of his term. Interestingly, in terms of timing, it took about an hour or so before another statement came from Joe Biden, then saying that he was issuing, throwing his full support and weight behind Kamala Harris to be the Democratic nominee now that he was jumping out, now that he was stepping down. There was a little bit, some conversation in the middle there, if you will, about why the wait. But at that point, this came out that Kamala Harris is going to be the nominee who he was supporting. And at that point, you saw a pretty strong and quick coalescing of the Democrats around Kamala Harris, a lot of different groups coming out in support of her to be the nominee for 2024.
Yeah, and some of the big names, I mean, as soon as Biden announced his support, you then had both Hillary and Bill Clinton announcing their support, and a raft of senators, congressmen, governors as well. But how secure is this nomination for Kamala Harris? How would a rival even sort of mount a challenge? What's the process going to be?
Well, it would start with a rival actually wanting to mount a challenge, Vinny. And so to that point, what we've seen so far is that not many are willing to. You had some of the names that have been bandied about in the past that would consider running for the president on the Democratic side. Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, Gavin Newsom of California, all three of those governors, all three of them came out and either endorsed Kamala Harris or said they would not be running to seek to replace her and take the nomination. You also just had this pretty incredibly quick coalescing in terms of the numbers, over 170 governors and lawmakers all backing Kamala Harris within about 24 hours or so for the nomination. So you would have to, Kamala Harris herself, I should say, has, in her statement accepting Joe Biden stepping back, said that she will earn the nomination. So there will be some kind of process there that goes beyond a coronation, if you will. There is talk of town halls, things like that she might do. The Democratic National Committee, the DNC, will meet on Wednesday to discuss the process going forward. But that said, if there isn't any other candidate, the only one that is, spoken up as potentially considering a run is Joe Manchin, an independent senator from West Virginia who would have to rejoin the Democratic Party in order to do it. If he's the only one who is running, well, then this basically is Kamala Harris's to lose.
Well, Jamie, you're joining us now from New York. This news broke for you at lunchtime yesterday. What was the feeling like for ordinary Americans?
Well, it seems to me, and you'll be amused to know I was with my Shakespeare reading group, where we sit around and we read a play, and we were reading, of all things, Julius Caesar out loud. And for us, all action stopped. And we, of course, went to the television. And my reports are from everyone I know, everyone did the same. Everyone stopped what they were doing. Immediately, the pop-ups happened at about 1:46 p.m., Twitter pop-ups and CNN News pop-ups, New York Times pop-ups, and everyone stopped what they were doing and went to the television and became pretty much glued to the television for about an hour. And then, of course, the news cycle begins to repeat itself and no real new news happens. But it was, as just has been said, that first announcement that Biden would be stepping down, and then the subsequent soon followed announcement that he was throwing his support to Kamala Harris. And it's interesting because although we saw it coming, I mean, many of us have been talking about this pretty much nonstop, together with the attempted assassination on President Trump for the last several weeks, and yet it still was stunning because nothing like this has happened in modern U.S. history, and I would venture in U.S. history. So we were all rather stunned and taking it in and playing it out, gaming it out. What happens next? What happens with Kamala? Can she win? How does she now go up against Trump in a debate as opposed to J.D. Vance? All of the possibles just took over the rest of the day and well into the evening. Until we all turned in rather exhausted from the dialogue at the end of the day.
Yeah, it is Shakespearean, perhaps very close to, Henry IV Part 2, the sort of handover of power from a sickly
right.
king. But Ryan, I want to bring you in at this point. With your campaigning hat on, Donald Trump seems to think he's in for an easier time with Kamala Harris, potentially the nominee. Is that just perhaps a bit of sexism, misogyny shining through, or does polling back that up?
We don't know how she'll play yet as a national candidate, but if you look at her background, she did run for the Democratic nomination against Joe Biden and proved to not be a very good candidate. She didn't make it even to the starting line. Other Democratic senators like Amy Klobuchar and others did better than her in that process. She has been, over the course of her vice presidency, polling fairly low, and I think that was one of the main reasons why people were nervous about swapping out Joe Biden before the debate, is that Harris's perceived weakness made her look like not a great option. Now, since the debate, Biden's poll numbers have fallen apart. The age issue just, became too much, and then his own party essentially decided it was time to give him a push. He was too mortally wounded to continue. So she does give them, at this point, a better shot, but she has enormous challenges as a candidate. She's not very popular. She will get the money from the Biden-Harris campaign, which is substantial. She's raised about $50 million in, I think, the first 24 hours. So that's a positive. Mm-hmm. It looks like the party is going to unite behind her. It does not look like there will be any serious challenge. Joe Manchin can run if he wants, but that's just essentially a vanity project for him. So she'll have the backing of the party. But look, she's not popular, but neither's Trump. And this is going to be a very interesting election with, third-party candidates in the race. Do they take away from her and others? We really don't know at this point. But she gives them a fighting chance that they really didn't have before Biden got out yesterday.
And Jamie, there's an argument that Kamala Harris hasn't been allowed to shine purposely because that's not the role of the VP. It was Joe Biden's time. It was his administration. But this campaign so far has been all about competency. That seems to, in a dangerous world at the moment, that seems to be key in voters' mind. This now, Donald Trump is, the oldest candidate in the race. There hasn't been as close a scrutiny of the many mishaps he's made in both kind of his public pronouncements and trains of thought in speeches. Do you think that is the plan now for Democrats to go on that line and use what has been thrown at Joe Biden against Donald Trump?
Well, it should be. It should be. And while I agree with what has just been said by Ryan, recent polls have shown Kamala Harris, and I will mention that I know her quite well from our days as practicing lawyers in the Bay Area. Recent polls have shown her to be competitive with Trump and even slightly ahead of Mr. Trump. And, I think we all are somewhat suspicious of polling after 2016, but, it's what we've got to work with. I know her to be a very determined and focused person, and I think she will bring that to this intense period that we're about to head into, 107 days to consolidate the support that she does seem to have from Democrats to establish herself as a credible national leader and to essentially prosecute a case against Mr. Trump, and she is a prosecutor. And I think you're right. She can now say who is the oldest candidate. If America is worried about a gerontocracy, who here is the older candidate? She is a young and vibrant 59-year-old. And as 59-year-olds go, she's very energetic and vibrant. And yes, perhaps she's not likable. Some of that I do think is a bit of misogyny that we have in this country about female candidates, but she can't bemoan that now. She has to just deal with it. And I think she's had time in the White House to think about it and deal with it. And I hope that in the 4 years that she's been there, she's given some thought in that second role, which is less public, to how to get past that. I worked for Al Gore, by the way, and I do agree that that secondary role, it's a difficult one because you're not in the public eye in the same way, obviously, but it does give you some advantages because you can think about how you're presenting yourself and make some missteps that people won't see. You get some access to the public. She had this border. She was sent off to the border, or she chose actually to go to the border and deal with a very tricky situation. And I think that taught her some important lessons that we will see her bring to the fore in the next 100 days toward the election.
Well, in the interim, Ryan, Republicans seem to be going on a 25th Amendment attack, saying if Biden can't run, then he's not fit to serve as president for the remainder of this term. Is this a valid concern? And potentially would actually swapping now to Harris help her at all, make her look more presidential?
I think it would benefit her if she was president now. I don't think Joe Biden's going to resign before the end of his term. It is a valid point. I mean, the Democratic Party rose up and said, Joe Biden, you're too old to be our nominee. You know, you're failing, basically. You need to get out of the race. So I think it is a valid point, but I don't think he's going to resign. What I do think, though, is that there is this sense that Joe Biden's decline in his age was covered up by Democratic Party insiders until I mean,
and they attacked media outlets who reported on this.
Correct, very much so. So what did Harris know about that? She obviously was the vice president. She was around Joe Biden. Did she see him declining? Did she see, what we all saw on TV in the debate over a period of months or years? I think that's a valid attack. Look, she owns the Biden-Harris record, the good and the bad. And, as the other guest mentioned, she was the quote-unquote border czar, which is a major issue for Biden and Harris. The border crisis that we have now is very unpopular with voters, especially independent voters, and she's going to have to own that and own her record with President Biden, who there are just concerns about what she knew about his decline. It is a very serious issue, and it's one that really it started out as a Republican attack, but now both sides concede essentially that Biden really isn't up to another term, and what did she know? When did she know it? Would be something she'll be asked, I assume.
And just finally, I want to briefly ask you both two questions. Lots of names floating about for who Kamala Harris should pick as her running mate. And also this question of Joe Biden. Does resigning secure a legacy for himself, which is, something that brings a line under his presidency showing that he entered when he was worried about democracy being in peril and the rise of the far right. And actually by doing this, it's quite symbolic of the sort of the power of a democracy, of peaceful transitions and handovers. Ryan, I'll ask you first and then Jamie, what do you think? Running mates and legacy for Joe Biden?
I think the obvious running mate for Kamala Harris is Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania. He's a very strong candidate. I think you're going to have a male on the ticket to balance it out. He brings a key state, Pennsylvania, where Trump was leading Biden before he got out. So he could potentially bring key votes in an important state, a must-win state. He had a bit of a national moment recently where he was out front after the assassination attempt on President Trump, where one of his constituents was killed. Really, I thought did very well in the national spotlight. He would be the most obvious pick, I think, out of the kind of the governors that are available. Governor Cooper of North Carolina is another one. He's not running for re-election. He's termed out, but I think Shapiro is the obvious choice. And then just on Biden resigning, look, I don't think he should resign as president. I think he can get to the end of the term.
His announcement that he's dropping out the race, yeah.
Look, it's the right decision for him. He would have lost the race, and he would have been blamed forever for bringing Trump back. At least now there's another person that can run. I think it will help his legacy. But look, whatever you think of Joe Biden, this must be an incredibly painful time for him and his family right now. This 50 years of his life he devoted to public service. To get to this point, giving up the presidency is very, very difficult. So I think it was a selfless action. It wasn't one that he wanted to do, obviously, but kudos to him at least for seeing the writing on the wall, realizing there was no path forward, and making a very, very difficult decision, not for himself, but for his party and in his view for the future of the country.
And Jamie, just briefly, running mates and what do you think legacy? Is it now sort of more secure for Joe Biden?
The running mate game is always a fun one. I like Sherrod Brown of Ohio. He would be a nice complement, especially up against the Trump team. He's fought against trade and tax policies that sell out workers. He's taken on Wall Street greed. So it's a nice balance up against this team of Vance and Trump. But I'll take the pivot to the Biden question because I really want to say something about that. I think, although it is painful, I agree for Biden to have given up the mantle of power. I think this may go down in history as something akin to George Washington's decision to leave the White House when he could have remained in that house for life at that time, at the founding of our country. Because, Frederick Douglass said that power does not give itself without a fight. And he could have said he wanted to stay in office, even though it wasn't in the best interest of the country. But instead, he said it is in the best interest of my party and the country to stand down. So even though Douglas said power concedes nothing without demand, in this case, Biden proved himself not a politician, but a leader who loves his country first. And that is a remarkable thing to see at this desperately important time in our country, and he'll be remembered for it, I think, in the long run.
Well, that was the journalist Jamie Floyd, former Mitt Romney spokesman Ryan Williams, and Monocle's Chris Chermak. Now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Vincent. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is headed to Washington today, where he is due to meet Joe Biden tomorrow and address the U.S. Congress on Wednesday. Later in the week, Netanyahu will be dispatching a delegation charged with negotiating a hostage deal with Hamas to an unspecified destination. Elsewhere, the Israeli military has ordered civilians to evacuate part of its designated humanitarian zone in southern Gaza ahead of what it called a forceful operation against Palestinian armed groups. Palestinians have reported the announcement was followed by intense Israeli strikes in and around Khan Yunis. And police in Greenland have arrested prominent anti-whaling environmentalist and Greenpeace co-founder Paul Watson under an international warrant issued by Japan. According to the Captain Paul Watson Foundation, the Interpol Red Notice is politically motivated as it believes Japan plans to resume high seas whaling in the Southern Ocean and North Pacific by 2025. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Vincent.
Thanks, Laura. Well, the news of President Joe Biden's withdrawal from the race has, of course, reverberated around the globe. Allied leaders have publicly paid tribute to Biden, but there is a detectable reserve of praise in some of their statements so as not to stoke the ire of a potential returning President Trump. While America's antagonists like President Putin and Xi Jinping have thus far remained silent. Joining us now is Lindsay Newman, head of global macro geopolitics at the Eurasia Group. Lindsay, thank you for joining us. Firstly, what have you made of the global response? Does it feel like leaders were expecting it?
Thanks, Vincent, and thank you for having me on. We've been hearing over the last couple days that this information around Biden's decision to step down, while no prior public leader, foreign official who had met with him made any statements, the closest we came was the Polish foreign minister saying after the debate in June that it's important to know when to manage your ride off into the sunset. We'd not seen any public official, public foreign leader actually come out and say anything and weigh in on Biden's decision. Now that the decision has been made, it's not surprising to hear news that there were concerns. There had been private concerns at the last G7, at prior meetings last year, all quite to be expected. But we imagine that this will remain, as you said, quite respectful because there's a long race ahead and it's not clear who's going to win it.
How concerned will allied nations be that what was already a chaotic election has become yet more complicated?
Well, the question around Biden's fitness for office, which the numerical age of 81 sort of came to heavily symbolize, felt so urgent from abroad because of what lurked behind it. And what clearly lurked behind Biden's ability to continue to convince American voters that he could run was the possibility that he would not be able to convince them. And this would be then the existential uncertainty, as you referred to, of a second Trump administration and what that would mean for Europe's security umbrella, what that means for transatlantic relations, what it means for tariffs on China, the Indo-Pacific relationship, and on and on and on. So we are now facing that existential uncertainty of a possible Trump victory and the unprecedented reorganization of the race on the Democratic side now just less than a month before the Democratic National Convention. The last time that the sitting president stepped down is really in the U.S. in none of our lifetimes, really, which was in 1968 with LBJ. So we are all watching this unfold, this uncharted territory.
Well, Kamala Harris has been busy the past 4 years jetting around the globe, meeting over 150 world leaders. But do we know much from her own short-lived presidential campaign as to whether there's much variation in her foreign policy stance?
That the storyline here, the headline here about Harris's foreign policy is going to be a Biden continuity story. I would say that she has taken about 17 trips abroad as VP. Not that many, not as many as, say, Secretary Blinken, who had upwards of 80. He's visited upwards of 80 countries. She has mostly taken on a surrogacy role while she's been VP. So going to those key conferences like the Munich Security Conference, the ASEAN Conference, APEC, in the last couple of years. So we have to expect that on key issues like Ukraine, like the relationship with Europe and NATO, that is really going to be a policy continuity story from what we've seen from Biden's approach about endless support for Ukraine, trying to defeat Russia, the pride, the legacy that you were all talking about just earlier around how NATO has been reinvigorated, how the relationship between Europe and the US has been re-enlivened. There is daylight, I would say, on certain issues like Israel. That is an area where Harris has demonstrated some difference in views, including around humanitarian aid, around human rights, around she's been characterized as more empathetic to Palestinians. I think another big issue that's worth flagging is immigration, which you did touch on in the prior, which is to say that this is a fundamental policy point for Trump. We also know it's a top issue area for American voters. Harris has been seen as associated with the administration's immigration policy. She did, as you say, go to the border in her first stint when Biden administration first came in office. Trump will use this as a point of leverage because we know that this is such an important hot button issue for American voters.
Well, we've seen here in the UK, the Labour Party, despite its victory, unexpectedly lost several seats due to falling support within the Muslim community due to the stance on Israel. How much of a concern is that going to be for Kamala Harris now? And particularly, of course, this difficult visit this week of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu set to address Congress after being invited by Republican Speaker Mike Johnson. How is she going to play this one?
So we know that this has been a difficult lane for Biden to navigate. He has been seen as providing unwavering support for Israel, and yet having clashed with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There was the rise of campus protests this spring, which Biden, quite frankly, just could not figure out how to navigate, and just had the reprieve of school actually being out of session. We have, as you say, Netanyahu arriving in Washington today. He will meet with Harris and will not meet directly with Biden, who is still recovering from COVID. Netanyahu will, of course, be here to address Congress as well as meet with members of the administration. He will also likely meet with Trump. Bibi himself is navigating these precarious waters as the conflict remains quite active. As I said, Harris has tried to differentiate herself a bit, has put some daylight on her view around the need for greater humanitarian access and aid for Palestinians in Gaza, has pushed for this ceasefire that Biden has also articulated. I would say that this is the area, Israel itself, should the war not end before Biden steps out of office in January, which feels unlikely, this will be the area that both Biden and Harris, as she sort of takes on for him, is the most mixed legacy for going forward.
Lindsay Newman of the Eurasia Group, thank you. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Finally, to the Farnborough Airshow, an international trade exhibition for the aerospace and defence industries, where civilian and military aircraft are demonstrated to potential customers, investors and enthusiasts in Hampshire, UK. Joining me from the Airshow is Monocle's contributing editor, Andrew Muller. Andrew, before we discuss all things aviation, you were in Washington, D.C. the week before last at the NATO summit, where everyone was watching President Biden closely, and he did make some exasperating slips of the tongue. Were you surprised when he finally called time yesterday?
Not even slightly, I have to say. I think it's one of those events that definitely falls under the arguably shocking but not at all surprising category. I mean, Biden has been in politics, 50 years and more since he was first elected to the Senate. I think he understands well that once momentum starts traveling in a certain direction, there is very, very little point in flailing against it. I think he understood, possibly later than he might have, but he understood that his time was up. And I think really after those dramatic flubs at the NATO summit, there was no going back. I mean, that is a little bit unfair. If you watch the rest of that press conference, he did actually address quite complex issues in quite a nuanced and thoughtful manner. but he also understands by this point how politics works. And I think possibly as soon as he introduced President Zelensky as President Putin, there was probably part of him that understood that the game was up.
We've been assessing what's been dubbed democracy's biggest year since January. How much more of a strain do you think this puts US election integrity?
US election integrity, I think it held up through its previous robust challenge, i.e. from Donald Trump, who lost the last one. And I think it is just a question of holding its nerve and holding its line. I mean, in 2020, despite Donald Trump literally standing over election officials, imploring with them to come up with votes from somewhere, people held the line. Even Republican officials decided they weren't going to go along with any such attempt. Now, obviously, we understand now that if Donald Trump loses this election, he will once again cry foul, claim it was fixed and claim it was a fake. One hopes that things are even more resilient than they were 4 years ago.
Well, turning to the air show now, what can we expect this week?
Well, we've only just arrived, obviously, and it has only just opened this morning. So far, the greatest excitement has been occasioned by the appearance of Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who I did sort of see weaving through the exhibition hall, surrounded by a small security detail and a very large number of people trying to take pictures of him. So the novelty appears not to have worn off just yet. Themes such as I can detect so far, interestingly, it is all about making aviation more sustainable. Honestly, to spend even a morning here, you would think that the environment and the atmosphere had no greater friends than the aviation industry. But it is actually genuinely interesting what people are talking about. Quite serious people talking about a near future when jets up to and including the size of an Airbus A320 or a Boeing 737 may run on hydrogen or may run on hydrogen-produced electricity. Slightly more alarmingly than that, I've also been speaking to people, and again, they seem quite serious, who think the idea of large jets being flown without pilots is entirely imaginable as well. So a future being laid out in a couple of sectors of, just very quiet, completely clean aircraft with nobody flying them.
Okay, yeah. Try selling that to passengers. And of course, the story dominating aviation this year has been Boeing and its many problems and the reputational damage it has had. Is that something that you think is going to be discussed a lot? I mean, we're seeing here orders being placed for Airbus by Virgin Atlantic. Japan Airlines is expected to, though, follow through with tentative orders with Boeing. Turkish Airlines in the middle of negotiating with Boeing. I mean, this is really a big moment for the aviation duopoly, isn't it?
It really, really is. I mean, it was foreshadowed ahead of this Farnborough that Boeing would be here with a slightly more muted presence than usual. I think I'm right in saying that for the first time in ages, they haven't brought any new aircraft here. I think they probably realised that it might be worth sitting this one out and hoping that their luck changes a bit before the next Farnborough. But yes, you're quite right. This has not been a banner few years for Boeing. And I suspect Airbus, who are here in some presence, have been looking forward to this Farnborough greatly.
Andrew Muller in Farnborough, thank you for joining us. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Chris Chermak. Our researchers were Gunnar Goronlid and Sana Jumani. And our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Vincent McAviney. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.